and public opinion holders alike. It's embarrassing to say that also for Israelis, but that's the case. Hence, the big-time debacle of October 7th, which so far, at least so far, has been transformed into a pretty impressive resurgence, mostly of domestic solidarity, left and right, and pro-judiciary reform, anti-judiciary reform. The level of volunteers is unprecedented. The response to the call-up of the reservists, and as you know, 75% of our military consists of active duty reservists. And when there was a national call to report to units, the response reached the level of 150%. Thousands of Israelis had to go back home because the units were filled very quickly. El Al has registered the all-time high number of flights in order to bring Israelis, at the request of Israelis overseas, back home in order to report to their units. And as I said, it encompasses left and right. Coming back to the war itself and the impact of this wake-up call, I would say primarily wake up from a suspension of disbelief, which has plagued, in my mind, the Western world for too many years, basically since the end of Second World War, and also suspension of disbelief, which has plagued a substantial part of Israeli policymakers, public opinion molders, and the fundamental disbelief or fundamental straying away from reality has to do with the difference between conventional wisdom on the one hand and real Middle East on the other hand. This has to do primarily with the idea that you can communicate with everyone, irrespective of their motivation, because after all, everyone should think like Westerners, namely everyone supposedly, and then I underline supposedly, should understand that standard of living, standard of education, standard of welfare, and peaceful coexistence is much, much more important than ancient 1400-year-old fanatic religious ideology. Well, we have been victimized by such simplistic, detached, conventional wisdom, and the most recent wake-up call took place on October 7th because Hamas was targeted by many bonanzas, many financial and diplomatic gestures which were supposed to enhance standard of living in Gaza, and the wishful thinking, the self-destructive wishful thinking was that Hamas certainly has to be preoccupied with ruling over the 1.5 million Arabs in Gaza, and therefore will not subordinate the livelihood of those 1.5 million to some, again, 7th century type of vision, aspiration to bring the infidel to submission. And the same type of wishful thinking has afflicted Western US policy towards Iran, where we have seen that the Ayatollahs of Iran have been recipients of 150 billion dollars, and even more than that, most of it, almost all of it, invested not in guns, not in butter, but in guns, as expected, by the way, as expected by anybody who is in touch with reality. I spent a number of years in Texas. I still interact a lot with Texas, and in Texas there is a saying that you can put your boots in the oven, but that don't make them biscuits. Well, apparently some people in Foggy Bottom, different research centers in Washington, the New York Times, Washington Post, still believe that if you put your boots in the oven, and if you really mean that, and if you really strive for that, it will become biscuits. Well, Hamas does not think that way. Hezbollah does not think that way. The Ayatollahs of Iran don't think that way either. And we're talking, as I said, about the real Middle East, not the wishful thinking or the virtual reality Middle East. And in the real Middle East, we are talking about a region which for the last 1400 years has been characterized by unpredictability, by violent intolerance, by tenuous regimes, and therefore tenuous policies, and therefore tenuous accords. Regimes in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, do not rise to power through the ballot. They rise to power through the bullet, namely through violence. And one day they will be toppled by bullet, not by the ballot. And as such, the policies of these countries are as tenuous as are their regimes, and the accords which they sign are as tenuous as are their regimes. And we, Israel primarily, but also the US, which has been pretty active in prior Israel-Hamas confrontations, those of us, again, who preferred wishful thinking to reality, were once again shocked by a very severe, violent violation of accords by Hamas. But that does not stop too many Western leaders, leading Western dailies, etc., to urge Israel to negotiate once again another accord with Hamas, to come to an agreement over ceasefire with Hamas, not realizing that every single accord, every single ceasefire, and the most recent ceasefire between Hamas and Israel took place literally until the day that Hamas decided to abort it on October 7th. But why learn from mistakes by avoiding, why learn from the past by avoiding mistakes? Why not learn from the past by repeating mistakes? And certainly, we're talking about the notion of an accord, which according to the West, it plays a major role in countries' national security. Peace plays a major role in national security, not in the Middle East. Not in the Middle East, sadly, unfortunately, but that's the nature of the beast, because in the Middle East, again, peace accords, normalization accords, ceasefire accords are as tenuous as are the policies of the regimes that signed them, as tenuous as the existence of the regimes that signed them. And in the Middle East, it's not peace. Peace is not, absolutely not, a major component, if at all any component of national security. The major component of national security is posture of deterrence. Our posture of deterrence here in Israel was bruised, almost demolished on October 7th. And what we have done since October 7th has been aimed at resurrecting our posture of deterrence, because posture of deterrence not only deters terrorism, not only deters wars. Posture of deterrence is the major cause for Arab countries to seek peace with Israel. The Saudis have expanded their ties with Israel unprecedentedly. It's not peace yet, but the defense and commercial relations are at an all-time high, way, way above the most optimistic assessment or projection. And the major reason has to do with Israel's posture of deterrence, which the Saudis deem the most important element for them in their battle against the lethal threats posed by the Ayatollahs of Iran, by the Muslim Brotherhood generally, by the Houthis terrorists in Yemen, etc. An eroded posture of deterrence in return for a peace accord would minimize, if not eliminate, any incentives for Saudi Arabia, for the United Arab Emirates, or Bahrain, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan to maintain peaceful relations with Israel. Another element which I would like to highlight here goes back to statement attributed to Churchill, who said that that Britain, or in this case Israel, might be fighting by itself, but it is not fighting only for itself. Because when one examines the vision or the aspiration of Hamas, it has to do with vanquishing the infidel West. In fact, Hamas charter of 1988 even targets the Rotary clubs in the West as a symbol of the culture which they abhor and they intend to bring to submission under Islam. The Hamas was established by the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you examine the charter, the aspirations, the vision of the Muslim Brotherhood going back to 1928 and intensified during the early 1960s, their aim is to first and foremost to topple the apostate Arab regimes, namely the non-universal Arab regimes. They intend to topple every single national Muslim regimes on their way to establish a universal Muslim Brotherhood type of society, following the principles of Islam, and then proceed to next step, which means to bring the Western world to submission, primarily, as they call it, the great American Satan. And certainly Iran, which has played a central role in the war between Israel and Hamas, in an ongoing clashes and potential war between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. Iran has not made it a secret that their utmost or ultimate aim is not limited to the Gulf, it's not limited to the Middle East, it's way, way beyond, stretching from Central Asia through Africa, all the way to South and Central America, in fact, all the way, literally these days, to further and further entrenching themselves, the Ayatollahs of Iran, in Mexico, along the US-Mexico border, because they view, again, the great American Satan as the #1 target. And I mentioned that because simplistically, one may look at the current Israel-Hamas war as Israel's business, as Israel's own war. This is not Israel's war alone. We're talking about Israel as a defense line. We're the first yard line of the Western team, and they view us, and correctly so, as a Western beachhead in the Middle East. They view us as role model of countering terrorism, and they have concluded, and rightly so, if they manage to weaken us, to defeat us, then the road to completing their voyage, their megalomaniacal aspiration, will be much easier to go all the way to the USA. Now, that aspiration may sound ridiculous in Western mind. Who do they think they are, the Ayatollahs of Iran, or Hezbollah, or Hamas, or ISIS, or Boko Haram in Africa? Well, we may think that they are toying with wishful thinking. They do not, and they don't care. They don't care what's the U.S. policy. There was Islamic terrorism in the U.S. during Obama's time. I'm sure we all remember the Fort Hood massacre of some 12 American soldiers. We all remember the San Bernardino massacre of, again, I think it was 13 folks, the Orlando Club, some 50 Americans. And during Trump's time, there was also terrorism. It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat. The major goal, the major aspiration is to bring the Western world to submission. And by the way, the Ayatollahs of Iran have very, very reasonable reason to proceed with that, because they look at themselves in February of 1979, when they just toppled the Shah of Iran, rising to power in Iran. They compare that to their current global stature, and they cannot but feel highly, highly optimistic, energized to proceed with that goal. Because part of that awakening, in my mind, should have, but hasn't yet taken, with regard to the policy towards Iran. Since 1979, the U.S. has followed systematically the diplomatic option, rejecting regime change option, rejecting a military threat, credible military threat option, claiming that this would be too costly, claiming that the Ayatollahs of Iran are amenable to peaceful coexistence and to depart from their fanatic religious goal if we, the West, are only understanding of their needs, offering them very, very lavish financial and diplomatic bonanza. Well, since 1979, when it was the United States, at that time, President Jimmy Carter, who provided a robust tailwind to the Ayatollahs to take over control of Iran. In the process, the U.S. stabbed the back of the American policeman of the Gulf, namely the Shah of Iran. Since that time, U.S. Has never stopped deluding itself that the diplomatic option is the right way, the only way to deal with Iran. In my mind, and I may be wrong, but in my mind, the U.S. should have been awakened a long time ago, certainly this time around, when Iran does not hide its complicity, I would say, central role in the current war with the Hamas, where Iran still bombs, not from yesterday, but for the last 10, 20 years, keeps on bombing, shelling missiles at American installations in the Persian Gulf area, Iraq, all the way to Syria. The response by the US has been very, very feeble, very Mickish-like response, which has only encouraged the Ayatollahs of Iran for more audacity at the expense of American interests, at the expense of regional stability. And as I said, this is while the Ayatollahs entrench themselves increasingly all the way from southern Chile to the US-Mexico border, collaborating with the major drug cartels in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil, collaborating with every single terror organization in Latin America, collaborating with every single anti-American regime in Latin America, because according to their own assessment, and rightly so, Latin America is the soft underbelly of the USA. Therefore, they focus on Latin America, and that has not awakened US policymakers yet to the reality of the Middle East. And before concluding my introduction, just a comment about the Arab world attitude. We haven't seen any Arab country flexing its muscle on behalf of Hamas. Certainly not military muscle, obviously, and certainly also not financial muscle, not diplomatic muscle. It's not the first time. Never, and I underline never, have Arab countries flex their muscle on behalf of the Palestinians. There has never been an Arab-Israeli war on behalf of the Palestinians, and Arabs have never involved themselves in any war between Israel and the PLO or Israel and Hamas. And the reason, without going into too many details, has to do with the Palestinian track record. Among Arabs, Palestinians have become role model of inter-Arab subversion and terrorism and ingratitude and treachery. They terrorized Egypt in the early 50s after Egypt allowed them to terrorize Israel from Gaza, which was then under Egyptian control. They terrorized Syria in the 1960s. They terrorized Jordan, which hosted them after they were expelled from Syria. They terrorized Lebanon in the south, and then they surged all the way to Beirut, causing series of civil wars in Lebanon. And when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, when Kuwait at that time was the most generous hostess of Palestinians, not just Palestinians, but Mahmoud Abbas's relatives and friends, Yasser Arafat's friends and allies and relatives. Once Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he was assisted by the Palestinians who benefited from the generosity of Kuwait. And Arabs understand very well that a Palestinian state in the Middle East, based on the Palestinian track record, based on the Palestinian conduct in the inter-Arab context, would only add fuel to the fire of the Middle East, threatening the Arabs' own regime. And therefore, when Palestinian leaders such as Mahmoud Abbas, whenever they arrive to Arab capitals, they do not receive the Western-style red carpet ceremony which welcomes Mahmoud Abbas whenever he comes. to the US, and I'm embarrassed to say to Israel as well, obviously London and Paris, etc. Arabs welcome Palestinians with a shabby rug. And the reason, again, has to do with their knowledge, their experience with the Palestinians, while Western leaders and too many Israelis still toy around with a virtual reality of the Palestinians, which has nothing to do, not with the Middle East at large, and with the Palestinian own track record. And last and not least is the U.S. Military involvement in the current war. We're talking about unprecedented U.S. military involvement, the aircraft carriers, nuclear submarine, 2,000 or so Marines are in the area. And in fact, recently, top American generals participating in most secret, classified Israeli discussions, planning of the war. On the one hand, it may be a source of concern for many Israelis. Are we losing our independence? But on the other hand, if we look back at Israel's war against Arabs, it's not that different from what took place in the past. Certainly, we never had aircraft carriers, we never had the nuclear submarine, but the direct involvement by American generals, American top military leaders in classified Israeli meetings and planning is a result of the reality of Israel. We have become, since 1967, the #1 research and development center for the U.S. Armed Forces, as, by the way, for the U.S. defense industries. We have become the #1 battle-tested laboratory of the U.S. Armed Forces. For instance, after the '67 war, 25 top American military officers came to Israel, spent here 3 months studying the lessons of the war, studying the Soviet military equipment, which we received as a result of the war, and they came back with a multitude of lessons which enhanced the stature, operational level, battle tactics of the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as the quality production export of the U.S. defense industries. After '73, in view of the benefits of studying the '67 war, after the '73 war, some 50, twice as many American officers came to Israel. They spent not 3 months, but 6 months. And they came back to the US with many more such lessons. And we have done the same thing after enduring every single clash with the Palestinians, whether in Lebanon or in Samaria or in Judea or in Gaza. This has been, in many respects, the very unique nexus between US and Israel. Obviously, from my perspective, I do not want to see direct American military involvement in any of our wars, certainly not against Hamas or Hezbollah, because I believe Israel's very unique profile among most Americans have also been, not entirely, but it has also been out of the perspective that, unlike NATO, we do not want American soldiers on our borders as NATO countries do. Unlike South Korea and Japan, we don't want American military bases. We are going to field the fighting core, yes, we need the American hardware, but again, by using that hardware in this battle-tested laboratory called Israel, or this research and development center called Israel, we also benefit tremendously the U.S. defense industry, the U.S. armed forces, which, by the way, renders the U.S. Much more in dollar terms than the scope of U.S. foreign aid to Israel. And to conclude it in a realistic view, I would go back to 1973. At that time, many Israelis were on the verge of desperation. Maybe we cannot hold on to a Jewish state in the Middle East. Maybe it's we are experiencing the destruction of the so-called Third Temple. Now, the reality, in hindsight, we know that we rebounded pretty quickly, and following the debacle of the beginning of the war, at the end of the war, we were very close to Cairo, very close to Damascus. And by the way, until this very day, American military academies teach the battle tactics used by Israel in 1973, because such a switch from close to destruction to very sweeping victory. In fact, it was Nixon and Kissinger which leaned on Israel to refrain from demolishing completely Egypt and Jordan and bomb Damascus and Cairo. And certainly we resurged to new heights in Israel, economically, technologically, educationally, medically, agriculturally, etc., since 73. I have no doubt in my mind, based again on the track record of Israel, we are going to do the same thing right now. Already, we see a different Israel, dramatically more optimistic Israel today than it was on October 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I'm certain that at the end of this war, and it may be succeeded by another byproduct, Israel-Hezbollah war, at the end of that war, or those two wars, once again, Israel is going to resurge to new heights. And from the U.S. point of view, many more benefits will be channeled, will be shared with the U.S., because let's face it, the U.S. has not been immune to Islamic terrorism. Only recently, the head of the FBI testified on Capitol Hill, proclaiming that in his view, Hamas-like tactics could take place in the homeland, in the USA. And when one is familiar with the Iranian relations with the drug cartels, which involve providing them with machinery for constructing underground tunnels from Mexico to the USA, when one examines the supply of Iranian Predator unmanned aerial vehicles currently used by the Russians against the Ukrainians, by the Houthis of Yemen against Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, similar unmanned aerial vehicles have been provided to the drug cartels, to Venezuela, and the target again is not the infidel Zionist in Israel. The target, as far as they're concerned, is the great American Satan, and Americans are doing the right thing, sending their top military officers to Israel at this stage to study how do we face the same affliction that could fall upon the Americans any day, any month, and anyone who is too complacent should only go back to the 9/11 experience, and again, as I mentioned before, to Islamic terrorism during Obama and during Trump and during Clinton, and not to be miscalculated or misjudging the reality that if you feed the beast will treat you pretty nicely. Islamic terrorism, just like terrorism all around, has been known to bite the hand that feeds them. U.S. learned that in Afghanistan. It was the U.S. which enabled the Mujahideen to push the Soviet military away from Afghanistan. In response, 9/11. It was the U.S. which provided the tailwind that catapulted the Ayatollahs to the helm in Iran, toppling the Shah. What was the response? Taking over the American embassy, holding over 50 Americans hostage for 444 days, and in effect becoming the most effective anti-US epicenter of global terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and proliferation of advanced military systems. We saw the same thing in Libya. It was the US that led the NATO assault on Gaddafi, enabling Islamic terrorism to take over Libya, and the response, as expected, was biting the American hands, namely taking over the American consulate in Benghazi, lynching the American ambassador and other American diplomats. And I would say exactly the same thing is taking place right now. Let no one go through suspension of disbelief. And please, let's study the main drive of Hamas, Hezbollah, Ayatollahs of Iran to realize they are not driven by despair, as the State Department deludes itself. They are driven by fanatic religious ideology, which currently is hitting Israel, but it has already afflicted the West as a whole, and it may afflict them even worse than the West experienced until today. I would like to end here and turn to your own, not only questions, but preferably if you have some criticism of anything I mentioned, I would be very happy to hear that and will try to respond.
Thank you, Yoram. I've asked people if you have questions or comments to send them to Tammy and me. But while we're waiting for a comment, I want to, again, thank you, Yoram, and ask you my personal question, which is, your message is overall, to me, very positive. That's how I perceive it. I don't know where Yoram went, but.
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. To me, it's a hopeful message. Can you tell us, for the Jews and our allies here in America who are taking a beating here on the streets here, literally and figuratively, can you tell us something hopeful? Or maybe this is not where your focus is. It feels like there's two wars going on, your war, the war in Israel, and the war on the streets in America. What do you have to say for us?
Well, first of all, when you talk about the war of anti-Semitism in streets of America, let's remember, going back to what I said about terrorists bite the hand that feeds them. The U.S., just like the West, has basically two choices. One is to fight the terrorist in the terrorist-owned trenches, and the other one is to withdraw from the terrorist-owned trenches and fight the terrorists in your own trenches, in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Miami, in Dallas, in Houston. And again, 9/11 was a thundering reminder, but as befits Western culture, 9/11 is already ancient history. We are now looking forward, and why deal with frustrating past track record? Let's deal with more optimistic, speculative future. And the outcome of what I said, or the conclusion of what I say, is that I believe the number one challenge of those who are concerned about the homeland security, national security of the USA, those who are concerned about US-Israel relations and Israel's own national security, is to educate people about their reality and expose misrepresentation and expose oversimplification and expose wishful thinking and expose, sadly, ignorance, because let's face it, the vast majority of Israeli policymakers, public opinion molders, are not really enmeshed in domestic American issues or American military challenges throughout the globe, whether it's China or Russia. Likewise with Americans, there's no reason Americans in the different districts or different states would dedicate much time to study what is the reality in the Middle East, which defies so much the editorials of the New York Times and the LA Times and the Washington Post and CNN and MSNBC or NPR radio. I mean, that takes too much time. And I think it's incumbent upon those who want to enhance homeland security in America to be in touch with reality and spread reality, not spread so-called propaganda, not spread headlines, but go back to history, go back to reality, and share that reality, not from the point of view of philo-Semite or anti-Semite, but from the point of view of realism rather than wishful thinking.
Thank you. Rabbi Small has a comment or question.
I have both. First of all, my comment, Yoram, it's good to hear and see you again. And I want to tell you, I am incredibly impressed by both the depth, incisive nature, and comprehensive fashion of the briefing that you just gave us. And it wasn't just a comment, it was a detailed briefing of just about the entire situation from many different perspectives. It was thorough, it was detailed, and it was very realistic. And I think for people who are accustomed to getting the narratives filtered through Western media, as many of us are, it offers a valuable perspective that we may not have had to this extent. And I agreed with every single one of the points you made. I'm especially encouraged, would be the wrong word because it's so dire, but I'm glad that you spent a considerable amount of your time focusing on Iran, because I agree that Iran is really behind and has raised the level of the conflict. I want to also express gratitude to Sharon Kornman and to Tammy Krashower for organizing this event, and also add my own voice to loving memory for Eugene Frisch. And it's a very apt way to honor him. So here's my question. We heard a lot about Iran and all of its proxies. Unless I missed it, which I might have, could you say more about Qatar? Because Qatar is, on the one hand, presenting itself to the Western world as a fair interlocutor and as our friends. And we know that America has an air base there that we seem to want to keep. On the other hand, Qatar has been pumping money to Hamas and has given a safe haven for some of the most diabolical planners of these heinous events. So my question is, what do you see as, what are the Qataris playing at? What is their deep game? And what is the best stance both for America and Israel? And they might be different in terms of the Qataris. And how can Israel punish Qatar, if that's what you think should happen, without upsetting the Abraham Accords?
Well, first of all, when one talks about, first of all, I thank you very much for your feedback. I may resort to another Texan quip attributed to LBJ. And LBJ, whenever he was introduced lavishly or complimented lavishly, he used to say, "I wish my parents would be here to hear it, because my father would have appreciated it. My mother would have even believed that." So I thank you very much for the feedback. And when it comes to Qatar and the Abraham Accord, let's again pay attention to the real Middle East. The Saudis, the Emiratis, Bahrain, they are at odds with Qatar, because Qatar is not only the number one financial backer of Hamas, Qatar is the number one financial backer of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is like the parent company. Hamas and multitude of many other terror organizations, from literally from Thailand all the way to Europe into the USA. And Qatar is in a way a pariah as far as the Saudis are concerned. The Saudis are very upset with US policy towards Qatar, Western policy towards Qatar. It seems to me that the Western attitude towards Qatar is determined by the Western preoccupation with finances. So Qatar has a huge, huge treasure which enables them to host the World Soccer Championship, and Qatar is able to support many universities throughout the world. Why bother with Qatar's strategic goal, which is identical with the Muslim Brotherhood, identical with Hamas? And by the way, Qatar is also very close to Iran, all of which sets it in the opposite side of the countries which have partnered with Israel through the Abraham Accord. Now, there is obviously short-term gain dealing with Qatar, which has to do with a very, very humanistic and sensitive issue of the hostages, some 240 hostages held by Hamas, and Qatar plays a major role here. But in the long run, in the medium run even, I would say Qatar must not be misidentified or misrepresented as an ally. Qatar is a major, major enemy, not just adversary of the Western world, because without Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood would be less effective. And by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood is literally involved, as we communicate now. They are involved in every single pro-American Arab country, trying to subvert and terrorize and topple the pro-American regimes. Muslim Brotherhood without Hamas would be highly, highly ineffective. And in my mind, and I'm not a policymaker here in Jerusalem or in Israel, but in my mind, neither US nor Israel should view Qatar as an ally, but rather as an enemy.
Yoram, I have a question from Rosalind. I'm not going to filter the question, so you can answer the question however you like. Why are the Palestinians willing to carry out Iran's terrorist agenda despite all their loss of life?
Well, when one talks about the Palestinians, just like when one talks about the Qataris or the Egyptians, we're not talking about Western societies. We're talking about the leadership at the helm, which is not there, as I mentioned before, because of the ballot. They're there because of the bullet. The majority rarely counts in the Arab Middle East. The majority goes along because they realize that punishment which they may be subjected if they do not go along with the rogue minority controlling them. Same thing applies to Palestinians. Palestinians are namely the PLO and Hamas, two adversaries, but both share the same goal, the same vision, namely establishing a state of their own in place, not side by side, but in place of the so-called infidel Zionists. And this is not an assessment. This is a reflection of the Palestinian education system, which, by the way, was not set by Hamas. School curriculum, school education system was set back at the end of 1993 after signing the Oslo Accord by Mahmoud Abbas, who was then the deputy of Arafat. Today, he's the head of the PA, and unbelievably, he is perceived, or I would say misperceived, by the West and too many Israelis as a peaceful coexistence partner with Israel, contrary to the education system, contrary to the Friday sermons of the mosques of the Palestinian Authority, contrary to the public and formal idolization of major Palestinian terrorists, contrary to the monthly allowances paid by Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority, to families of terrorists, and by the way, including Hamas terrorists who were involved in the October 7th massacre or war. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't claim to be an expert on education, but as far as I'm concerned, education system reflects most authentically the vision, the goals of the educating party. Just like us parents or grandparents, that which we educate our children and grandchildren reflects who we are, what are our values, and the values shared with the Palestinian youth by the school system, not of Hamas, but of the Palestinian Authority, has to do with doing away with the Jewish state. In fact, the education system established by Mahmoud Abbas has become the most effective production line of terrorists. Any graduate of the Palestinian school system, which is K through 12, is a potential recruit to one of the multitude of terror organizations in the Palestinian Authority and in Gaza. The same thing applies to the charter of the PLO, which is again Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority. And I don't know if people here are aware. The charter of the PLO was compiled in 1964, 3 years before the reunification of Jerusalem, 3 years before Israel returned to Judea and Samaria, West Bank. Namely, the charter refers to 1948 Israel, to pre-1967 Israel, and the charter of the Fatah organization, which is the most important PLO organization, was compiled in 1959, 8 years before the 67 war. So going back to the comment, to the question, I apologize for the lengthy response. Palestinians, namely the Palestinian leadership, acts in accordance with their own vision. And it doesn't matter that they received in Oslo, the Oslo Accord 1993, a major benefit accorded by Israel, which no Arab country ever gave the Palestinians. Jordan controlled the West Bank until 67. Never occurred to them to transfer it to the Palestinians. Egypt controlled Gaza until 67. Never occurred to them to transfer it to the Palestinians. In 1993, Israel committed itself and actually followed the most dramatic gesture ever, according to the Palestinians. The response, as expected, as expected. And when I say as expected, I voiced exactly the same thing the day this horrific agreement was announced. They launched an unprecedented campaign or wave of terrorism against Israel because, again, terrorists bite the hand that feeds them. You commit yourself to gesture to terrorists, you commit yourself to retreats, to appeasement, and you reflect weakness. And weakness whets the appetite of terrorists, and therefore it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many are killed. It doesn't matter how many bonuses they received, how generous the bonanza they may receive. They stick to their goal because, unlike West, radical elements in the Middle East, Islamic terrorism, including the Ayatollahs, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority, they value vision, aspiration, more important than standard of living. If this would not be the case, the Ayatollah of Iran would long ago be part of the peaceful coexistence family in the Middle East. If that would not be the case, then by now, Israelis and Palestinians would peacefully coexist. The fact is that every time we indulge in Western-oriented wishful thinking, we are awakened by another offensive by terrorists. And once again, we open our eyes, but sadly, for very, very short time.
Yoram, what you said really goes into, I'm going to give Angela the final question, I think. She had a long opening about the role of social media. And but her question is, and I don't know that you can answer the question, but maybe you have a positive message. Given what's happening, given the way people in the West are thinking and how they're talking and the demonstrations, etc., how long can we expect the politicians, Western politicians, to continue to support Israel when they're going to be losing, they may be losing constituents? How, what will happen if this war does not end soon, and how would you define soon?
The last thing that we should do is follow a fatalistic style of behavior or policy. We, namely friends of Israel in the US, Israel can have an impact on American public opinion. And once again, it has to do with education, education, and education.
So what should we be doing? Yoram, tell us, the people here, what should we be doing?
My experience in the US, which goes back some 50 years from my days as an activist on American campuses during my undergraduate and graduate studies in Texas and then in California, through my different diplomatic services in the US, in the Southwest, in Washington, and throughout the last 33 years of systematic presence on Capitol Hill and different communities in the US, many of them part of small town America, flyover America. I'm certain, I'm convinced that the vast majority of Americans are open-minded. Whether they are Democrats or Republicans, they are open-minded. But the vast majority of Americans do not spend the time, and it's obvious, to study an issue which is not their immediate concern. And therefore, I think it behooves us who know, first of all, to enhance our own education, and God forbids not to rely on the media And again, whether it's Wall Street Journal or New York Times, whether it's Fox or CNN, it seems to me that the issue deserves and requires a much more serious study of facts, of reality, than relying on daily media or on social network. And once we enhance our own education on the subject, share it. Myself, I'm an avid believer in the power of the US legislature, and with which I've been in touch since 1989 on a sustained basis. 3-5 times a year, I visit Capitol Hill. In fact, I'm going to be there in 3 weeks again. And from my experience, Capitol Hill is extremely central in formulating U.S.-Israel relations. Many people err into assuming that the President and Secretary of State, they are the sole proprietors of the U.S. foreign policy and national security policy. It is wrong. In the U.S., according to the U.S. Constitution and according to a litany of precedents, the legislature is indeed co-equal and co-determining, not only when it comes to domestic issues, but also when it comes to national security issues. And I mentioned that because you have your own House representative or representatives. I'm not familiar with a congressional map of Connecticut. You have 2 senators. And I think it behooves people who care to share their position with the office of the senators and the House representatives. And again, from my experience, they care about it. I know there's a lot of cynicism about Capitol Hill. Oh, they only care about their own style of living. They only care about their own promotion. This is not the case. When you walk in the corridors of the House or the Senate, you can virtually hear what I call the battle cry of the American constituents. We shall remember in November. And it's impossible to underestimate the fear that legislators have of the reaction by constituents. I remember one day I met one of the senators who told me that Israel must change its settlement policy because he received last week, he told me, 50 messages from his state criticizing Israel's settlement policy. And my immediate question was, who are those 50 people? Are they top contributors? Are they major movers and shakers? Are they academics, media people? Who are they? And the response was, I don't know and I don't care. Here on the Hill, we don't talk logic. We don't follow logic. We follow the conception that if you get 50 messages per week, you better pay attention. And it doesn't matter whether they are movers and shakers or just so-called common people in the district or in the state. And therefore, don't underestimate your impact. And again, I resort to Texas. There's a saying in Texas, sometimes even a blade of a grass can deflect a cannonball. Everyone who participates in this Zoom session has much more clout than a blade of grass. And therefore, again, I urge you, get involved with your congressman, with the 2 senators, get involved with your local media, share with them your sense of realism. There's no downside to that. There's only.
I want to say there's 3 things.
Do not do not follow the fatalistic view. You can have an impact.
There's three things you can do to that point, and I think this will be the farewell and the thank you, Yoram. People on this call, number one, there is a rally in Washington, D.C., and there is, if for the Connecticut region, there are buses being organized for that. If you can go and be a body and be counted, that would be great. Other things you can do are support AIPAC, which is another way to get your voice heard in Congress and the Senate. You can do that. And then the last thing is on LinkedIn, I posted, so you can find it on my LinkedIn page. There's a very simple way to type in your zip code, and it will give you a very simple, you press a button to your representatives, and then you can make that phone call and just leave a message. So that'll take you a minute. So there's 3 different ways you can go there with. Personally, you could send your dollars to AIPAC, and you can make a phone call without even getting out of your chair. So,
Sharon, can I add a 4th way?
Sure.
This is not because of self-promotion, but I
Yeah.
think it could be helpful. I have a website
Yeah.
with much more information that I shared with you. It's oriented to what's in it for America, not only what's in it for Israel. And the website is www. In one word, the Ettinger report, Ettinger with .com, www.theettingerreport.com. There you also have my email address, and I would love to communicate with any one of you via email and share some more information.
Yoram, not to put you on the spot, but most of this was taped. Can we put this on the synagogue website, or you prefer not?
No, absolutely.
Okay, then we're going to do that because the timing, a lot of people I think are going to hear about it and wish they attended. And as Rabbi Small said, this is really a briefing. This was a lot of information. Thank you.
And again, I'll conclude by
Yeah,
another reference to Texas. In Texas, they say, I don't care if you steal my thunders as long as there is rain.
Okay, thank you. That's very nice. I'm going to put that quote on as well. Okay,
Very good.
thank you so much. I see you in 3 weeks, Yoram.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you all for coming and taking the time out of your day.
First to Paul.
All right. Bye-bye.